Welcome to Women Winning Divorce. I am your host, Heather Quick. I am an attorney, entrepreneur, author, and founder of Florida Women's Law Group, the only divorce firm for women by women. I love thinking big, thinking outside the box, creating creative solutions for women, and empowering women to win in all aspects of their life. Our approach at Florida Women's Law Group is to provide women with a strategy to not only achieve their objectives, but win at life. I believe that what may show up as adversity is simply an opportunity to change and improve your life. In each episode, I sit down with innovative professionals and leaders who are focused on how you can be your best self before, during, and after divorce. In these conversations, we are looking at how women can win at life. I have the unique opportunity to meet women when they are at a transition period of life. But that is only the beginning to becoming your best self and winning at life on your terms. With our guests, we enjoy the opportunity to explore ways all women can win and enhance their life, no matter where they are in their journey. Because divorce is just a point in life, not the end and not what defines you, rather a catalyst for your growth. Alrighty, welcome to this week's episode of Women Winning Divorce. I'm Heather Quick, owner and attorney of Florida Women's Law Group. Today, I'm being joined by Judith Kaluzny, a career divorce and family law attorney. Judith has had over 40 years of legal experience and specialized in mediations, pre- and post-marital agreements, and partnership agreements. And she now writes for a local publication, Fullerton Observer. Welcome to the show, Judith.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here.
I am so excited to have you. You have a wealth of experience, and I know some great stories and insight into our topic today, which is marital agreements.
Yes. Well, it's since the early 70s that marital agreements have been legal. Before that, the courts refused to enforce any premarital agreements because they thought it made divorce too easy.
We all know it's never an easy process, right?
Kind of a patriarchal attitude. It's like, these are two adults and making a contract.
Yes.
Marriage in the first place is a contract. And the terms of that contract, unless you do your own agreement to change them, the terms of the contract are set by your state law. So there's community property states. I noticed that Florida is not listed as a community property state. However, their law calls it marital property. That what you acquire during marriage is called marital property and it's owned equally. So it's in effect community property. But Florida just uses a different word.
We do. We use different words. I think, for those who are in a community property state, we are considered a separate property state. However, there are many ways that your premarital property becomes marital. And, once you commingle, which we certainly will be able to talk about that. But I think that is such an important part that you bring up, Judith, that I hope our listeners, if they didn't catch it, I'm repeating it, because when you get married, you are entering into a contract. And without a written agreement between you and your husband-to-be, you're going to be subject to the laws of, where you divorce. So you may marry in California, you may end up divorcing in Florida or vice versa. But regardless, you don't get to pick, right, Judith? You're subject to the law.
Unless you write your own agreement.
Exactly, which is such a smarter way to enter into a contract by doing your due diligence and really coming up with a prenuptial or maybe a postnuptial agreement. We're going to get into all of that as we begin, but I think it's best to even just start with some definitions for our listeners, because I think that people get there for all of us, actually, and I'm going to include myself, unless it's a legal area where I have some experience and expertise, but people get their knowledge of prenups from movies and celebrity headlines, right? So they really I think there's a misconception that it's really only for the super rich, or only if I've got a trust fund and my parents make me do it, right?
Yes, especially there was one movie with Catherine Zeta-Jones and what's his name? Who's
George Clooney. George Clooney.
George Clooney, yes. And she finally captured him just to get revenge for his playboy attitudes. And the next morning after they were married, she says, now everything you have is half mine. And that's not true.
Right.
That's where people get these mythologies. There was a conference one time where one judge says, if I could change one thing about family law, it would be to remove it from any TV or movies.
I do love it though when they have those movies, and that was a good movie for our listeners. We'll put it in the show notes because I do remember that, and it was all about the prenup and the airtight prenup that you couldn't break. But then of course there were areas where it was countered, but that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, because I really would love for our listeners, Judith, to hear about your marriage license handbook.
And this is just the size of the driver's license handbook. So I call it Rules of the Road for Getting Married.
I love it. And is that specific to California, or do you think it's kind of broad enough?
I think it's broad enough because there are a lot of for instance, the premarital agreements. There is a uniform law. There's a commission that functions since about the 1970s, and it's called the Uniform Law Commission. And so there's a uniform premarital agreement law that 26 states or 28 states have adopted. So it makes it uniform, the rules. So when I have listings in here of things to include in a marital agreement, it applies everywhere. And also the rules, being married as being a contract, the essence of any contract is consent. And so consent is essential for marriage, and it's essential for a premarital agreement. And it has to be free consent, free from duress. I mean, there was a time that it was considered, well, in some states or some rulings, it might be considered that if you were given the prenup to read on your way to the altar, it was duress. Like you were under some compulsion to sign. California law says it's not a valid contract unless the other party has been presented the written agreement at least 7 days before the wedding. I don't think Florida has a limitation on that.
They don't, but it's a similar, I think through case law though, there is, again, right? Like not prior to walking down the aisle, and you need to have adequate time to review and assess. Obviously, the best case scenario is having an attorney advise you, because then that's going to give it definitely some more credence, understanding, your rights and what it is you're reading and what makes sense about it. But it's certainly not necessarily required, but I find it very rare that two individuals have a prenup that wasn't drafted by a lawyer and advised by a lawyer that is going to really meet the requirements necessary.
For each person?
Yes.
A lawyer for each. Yeah, it's not necessary. There could be a valid waiver, but still, most people do. I had a young couple that came in for a prenup. They were going to live with her parents, and she was already living with her parents, and she was paying the mortgage by way of rent. And they agreed, I mean, she wanted, and the husband to be agreed, that there not become a community interest in the house. Now, her wages are community property once they're married. So if she uses community property to pay the mortgage, then the community gets an interest in the house.
Okay, yeah, that's very different than in Florida, even though it's titled in her parents' name.
Right. So we did a premarital agreement that made sure that her earnings were separate, and that any payments on the house would remain separate property. So anyway, but they were really cute because we negotiated that way ahead, but they didn't come in to actually sign the agreement until the day of the wedding. So they each came in separately, dressed in their wedding garments, and they came separately because the groom's not supposed to see the bride before the altar. So they were cute. Anyway, so that was a nice agreement.
That is, Yeah, that's interesting. That's so cute though. You're right. Like you said, they came in separately because it was the day of the wedding, not to see one another. But clearly they had the right outlook on it, because I think too often, some of our listeners included think, oh, well, that's going to just really ruin the romance or our idea of getting married, versus no, you're just going to have a little more control on some things that maybe you don't even know that might become an issue, or things such as, what if one of you stays home, gives up your career to stay home with your children? I think that's a really important issue that we certainly talk about with many women, that, look at that, and how are you going to be compensated if there's a divorce? Because the alimony laws, we have some pretty strong alimony laws in Florida, but they're subject to change and always up to the legislator to challenge. So, of course, come divorce time, husband's always like, go get a job. And maybe you've been out of the workforce and it's a little bit harder. And you could have really negotiated that in a prenup when everybody's happy and we all agree that one person gives up, working to stay home with children.
Yeah, well, that attitude was endorsed by Governor Brown II when the legislature proposed a law to require premarital agreements. Oh. And Governor Brown vetoed it. He said it was not romantic.
Well, yeah, divorce isn't romantic either, right? So at least it would.
But prenups are not just for divorce. They're to a problem-solving device. So you have agreements beforehand, so you know who's going to manage the money, and are we going to have a budget? It saves a lot of arguments after divorce, or misunderstandings or anxieties. I think it's a very useful tool.
Well, and I think also, like you said, because if done correctly, which I think is the way to do it, you can have discussions about things before it's an argument on an issue. It's like, hey, this likely will come up in your marriage. Do you two want to kind of talk through how you want to address it, or how you want to deal with that in the future?
Right. One thing you could even put in your marital agreement or premarital agreement is how to solve problems. Like, agree that if we have an impasse in our discussions, we will go to a mediator. Mm-hmm. Put that in an agreement.
And I think that's great. Now, tell me this, in your opinion, because you've been doing this for many years, who should have a premarital agreement? I mean, is it for everybody or certain groups of people? Like, what do you think?
Well, it's very often thought of as just for property, but I think that it's you can include the rights to use property or buy and sell property, and you can use it to talk about spousal support in case that the marriage ends. You can talk about making mutual wills, or any death benefits from pensions, any other personal rights and obligations. I want to make one point. If you have a premarital agreement and one spouse waives rights to pension benefits, that is not enforceable, because only a spouse can waive the rights. And in a premarital agreement, you're not a spouse yet. So according to federal law, that if you waive a pension right in a prenup, it's no good. You'll have to do it in a postnup.
So in that case, could you do a prenup to address really everything else?
Yes.
And then say, and really maybe even include in there, and we intend to execute a postnup on the single issue of a pension.
Pension, right.
Now, go ahead.
You cannot include in a premarital agreement is custody and support of children. That's just not done.
Correct. And certainly not enforceable. And now in Florida as well, a lot of temporary issues you can, there are some things you can address that may or may not be a final issue as well. Now, what about, I want to touch on very quickly, it may not be quick, but, when we're talking about domestic partnership and having that agreement for those individuals, could you tell our listeners, like, what's a little bit different about that? And how is that so helpful?
Well, it's not really very different. It's because it's a commitment that's registered with the state, a domestic partnership, and the separation and ending it, you go through the same process. I mean, in California, we use the same forms for a divorce or a partnership, and you just check a different box.
Where in Florida, that would be very different. And at least at this stage, when we're talking about, you wouldn't file in family law court if you weren't officially married. But if you have a domestic partnership agreement, then it would be a civil suit, but it would be enforceable. So it would be very different here in Florida.
I see.
If you don't have that, you've got what you've got, and you aren't going to have any rights whatsoever. And family law is not going to review anything if you have not been married.
Well, a contract is a contract.
Correct. So you really need a contract if you're not going to get married.
And if it's in writing, of course. A verbal contract, as they say, ain't worth the paper's written on.
Exactly. Well, we are going to be right back. We're going to take a quick break. And listeners, please take a moment to subscribe and review our podcast. Available on most major podcast platforms like Spotify, Apple, Google, and iHeartRadio. We will be right back. Welcome back, listeners. Again, today I am joined by Judith Kaluzny, and we're discussing marital agreements and how they can impact your divorce. Now, one of the things that I wanted to talk about prior to, we just didn't get to it in the last segment, but I think that, Judith, you've mentioned when you've previously been interviewed that the process of divorce can be illogical. Now, having a marital agreement, can that create more control and predictability?
I would say so, yes. And
tell us a little bit more about the illogical part of the divorce and the process.
Oh my, when you go through the litigation process, it ends up, at least in my county, with an endless series of hearings and mostly continuances. I had a young man that was working for me that his wife was nice. They just wanted to get a parenting plan, but her parents hired a lawyer for her. And the hostilities mounted. And he came back from court for the fifth time, and all 4 continuances. The fifth time he finally gave up and just had this agreement for the parenting. And I said, don't worry, Juan, there's still the trial. He said, what? You mean there's more? So it's a settlement of property issues and an agreement for support. Now, why in the world don't you just hire a certified financial advisor and to help you divide the property if necessary? I had a man that came to me. He lived across the street from my office, so he saw my sign and he wanted to mediate. His wife had already filed, and she had a very nice lawyer that did the first thing, a parenting plan. Well, that was nice, but they had a lot of property and assets, and so he wanted to mediate. Well, I couldn't contact her because she had a lawyer, so I wrote for him a proposed interim marital agreement that defined the process by which they would evaluate and divide their properties. And it included a support offer of which amounted to half his salary, which was $10,000 a month. I mean, the half was $10,000, so it was a good support offer. Anyway, she took that, and I think she must have talked with her PTA ladies, because she fired her nice lawyer and went to the #1 shark of Orange County. 4 years later, and $429,000 in attorney's fees and many meetings, husband and wife went to a coffee shop, spent all night, and worked out their own agreement. Now, why not do that at the beginning? Why is the court is an enabler of this behavior that provides for a lot of income for that people pay for?
Well, I hear you on that. And I think what happens for a lot of folks, one, they don't know what they don't know. And so, and of course, with divorce, we're dealing with so many emotions, and the person that, you committed to. So I think the emotions sometimes get a little bit taken away, allow people to make decisions that aren't always really in their best interest. And they also just don't have any idea about the process, which is why your handbook would be very helpful for individuals. Like, at least do that before you get married. Have some understanding of what legally you're getting involved in. And then, I think it's often hard. I mean, for, women getting divorced, and they go to their lawyer and they don't know, and they suspect their husband may be up to no good. So there's a lack of trust going into the process. And I think that's what happens, whether it's actual or not, right? The trust is gone. And whether there's deceit going on, I think that can kind of often color the path that the divorce takes. And sometimes it's very hard to get folks back on track. Because, I mean, in Florida, and I would imagine California's the same way. I mean, the finance, it's going to be open. We're going to see everything. It's very rare that there are those hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands that no one knows about. That's been my experience.
Right. And it's there's, in the premarital agreement, to make it enforceable, there has to be full disclosure of all your assets and finances before you get married. And during marriage, there is a fiduciary obligation of one spouse to another. And that means you deal with financial matters with highest good faith and fair dealing. And it's required when you're going through divorce, a round of complete disclosure. And still, and the fiduciary obligation applies until all the property is identified and valued and divided. It does not end when you file for divorce, the fiduciary obligation. So there was a woman in California that used community money to buy a lottery ticket, and she won the lottery, but she didn't tell husband. Ooh. And there are severe consequences for breach of fiduciary obligation. And he found out, and he took her to court, and as punishment, the judge did not just divide the winnings, he gave it all to husband.
Wow. Now, I couldn't see that happening in Florida. I think that would be overturned for sure to get more than half. But there's nothing, codified in the law as far as a fiduciary duty from one spouse to another.
In California.
Yeah. So is that, and I love talking with especially lawyers in other states just to compare the differences. So that's a large obligation, as you and I both know, a fiduciary obligation to your spouse, which, that would be helpful in many cases in Florida, because you ought to, as your spouse, I mean, right, it makes sense to us all, but unless the law were to address that, which it doesn't in Florida, then that imposes quite a requirement on you, especially if you breach that duty, like the lottery ticket. And those are some pretty severe consequences.
Well, the Uniform Law Commission, which is also known as the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws. I love that, National Conference of Commissioners. They wrote back in the day, probably in the 80s, a Uniform Marital Property Act. And they started off saying that marriage is a partnership to which each spouse makes a different but equally important contribution. Well, now only one state has adopted the Uniform Marital Property Act. You want to guess which one? No, I'll tell you, Minnesota. That's the only state that has adopted the Uniform Marital Property Act. And I
would never have guessed that, Judith. So I'm glad you told me.
Oh, it's Minnesota, it's Massachusetts. So.
Oh, okay. All right, another M.
Okay, and then there's another uniform law besides the Uniform Premarital Agreements Act that was adopted in 1983, and 26 states adopted that. And then in the year 2012, they updated that and they made it a Uniform Premarital and Marital Agreements Act. So they included agreements made after marriage, and only 2 states have adopted that. So it's still hanging out there.
Now, and that brings us to the postnuptial agreement, because we have, in my experience, we have drafted some of those.
Yeah.
And I wonder how, but they're not as well known or thought of, I think, by most people as like, well, why would I do it now? And I think that's a good thing to address, like in your experience.
That's why I put that in the book here.
Okay.
I had a client for a divorce one time that she had established her own business 11 years before the separation. And she had consulted with the lawyer because she wanted it to be her separate property. And the lawyer said to her, oh, no, it has to be community property. Well, that's not true. She and her husband could have had a written agreement that made her business her separate property.
Mm-hmm.
I had one case of a post-marital agreement where husband was getting really anxious about wife's spending habits. And he didn't want to get a divorce. He loved her still, but still he was driving him nuts. So they came in and we worked out a separation of finances so that he would no longer be responsible for her debts. And I told them they need to file this with the county recorder, because that would be official notice to any creditors that he and the marital property was not responsible for her debts. So whether the creditor, actually knows it or not, being recorded in the public records makes it official notice. So he was protected that way.
And, I think that is another point with a postnuptial, which very often, one of the things I see, there's a disagreement and, or maybe, some violation of trust, which can be financially, can be many other indiscretions. And so a postnuptial can be a way for couples to, bridge that gap and begin to build trust and say, well, you know what, if we're going to work on this, let's start and enter into a postnuptial on some of these things that have caused us trouble. And I think many times it can help people stay married because now they've addressed those issues that are causing some problems or cause them more concern. Like, well, what if I try to work on this marriage and then you divorce me anyway and, blah, blah, blah happens, right? And this eliminates that what if. Would you agree?
Yes. Nothing like an agreement in writing. So, but the same rules apply as to disclosure for a post-marital or a post-nup agreement.
Well, and actually in Florida, the disclosure is more specific, because with a postnuptial, now you are signing away rights that you do have in Florida. So versus the premarital, you're not married yet. So you don't have a right to inherit, or you don't have a right under our laws, and I'm sure as in California, that you would as a spouse. So now there is a bit more due diligence, a little bit more specific and thorough in our disclosures to make sure that postnup stands up to any type of challenges later on in the event of a divorce.
Yes. Yeah, and it's people really need to know about community or marital property and separate property, and how to keep things separate. I had one case. I think the judge was wrong, but still, the judge decided that wife was a teacher and she had a separate bank account where she put her earnings, and she inherited money from an aunt. It was only about $30,000, but she put that in the account. Well, in the divorce, the judge said her account was community property because it was earnings, and that separate property inheritance, she commingled with community property, so the whole thing became community property, and she lost half her inheritance.
That sounds like a very bad ruling. I agree, Judith. I would disagree with that judge as well. That doesn't sound like, well, the spirit of the law, especially with inheritance, because those definitely are treated differently in Florida. You can't commingle them. Right. However, with that amount, it would have been very easy to trace and to know.
Yes, exactly.
But, Judith, your, expertise has been helping people think logistically what marriage means financially as well as legally. Now, can you give our listeners a few examples of some things that they ought to consider before they're getting married?
Well, yeah, you can consider how do you intend to make financial decisions? And what if one person makes substantially more than the other?
Mhm.
You know, and suppose you wanna have separate earnings, and well, some couples do this. They have uh, his and hers bank accounts, and then they have a joint account for paying joint expenses. Well, if one party makes double the other, is it fair to share 50-50? I don't think so. And I think
Doesn't
that
seem to be. No. Hmm.
and then will you have a budget? Who's going to manage the budget? And kind of like, what are your long-term financial goals? And then you could even include things from daily life, like household chores. And as I said before, how to make decisions if you can't agree, and and how to work through conflict.
Now, do you advise that, because we know that the premarital agreements can't dictate like who's going to have, say, custody of the children, and it can't try to place in there the best interest of the children. However, do you suggest maybe that you put in agreement things that how we're going to handle things in regards to our children, like schooling
Yes,
or medical care?
yes, the parenting plan. I admire Florida. You have a parenting plan. You do not do custody.
Yes,
California,
time sharing is what it is called.
yes. Tiger Woods did a parenting plan.
Yes, he
instead
did.
of California rejected that concept in 1989.
Really? Seems like they would be more forward thinking on that instead, and not treat children like property. You'd think that.
So you would think so, but there's at least 17 states that have abandoned the ugly word custody. That's a fighting word, you know?
Well, you're right. I have never heard somebody say that. It's a fighting word, but I absolutely agree with you 100%. You're right.
Because there's three words that go with it: win, lose, and battle. Custody battle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I hear you. I think that is a great place to pause on our break, but just such a great point that I find very
Yes.
very true. So we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back. During this time, listeners, please take a moment to check us out on social media: For Women Law on Facebook and Instagram, Florida Women's Law Group on LinkedIn and YouTube. And we will be right back with Judith. Welcome back, listeners. Judith and I are here today discussing marital agreements, which most of you have heard the term prenup, which is a prenuptial agreement before marriage. And then there's also a postnuptial agreement, meaning after you have been married. And there's also domestic partnership agreements. So if you and your significant other are not getting married, but if you're going to enter into financial decisions, and maybe even children together, that's a very wise step to take and have a domestic partnership agreement. I don't think we see those as often in Florida as probably you do in California, Judith, but they would be enforceable and be able to be upheld, certainly as it relates to the financial obligations and rights.
Yes. Yes. There's another aspect that I just remembered, that there was a little squib in the paper that said that there's a surge in the number of husbands and wives who are living separately and apart. Like 4 million, this article said 4 million Americans that are married are now living separate and apart, but staying married.
Huh. That's very interesting as far as why they make those decisions. Now,
well, I'll tell you, here's a quote from Katharine Hepburn.
Okay.
Sometimes I wonder if men and women really suit each other. Perhaps they should live next door and just visit now and then.
I think there are many people who agree with that statement.
Jacqueline Bisset said, this actress, remember her?
Yes.
Ideally, she said, couples need 3 lives: one for her, one for him, and one of them for together.
Well, and I think that's like both of those, just, I think to me, the way I hear it is you need to have your own identity in your own life within a marriage, be your own person, have your own identity and some space. And yes. I think that allows marriages they can flourish, and still if everybody can maintain, hey, who they are, and they don't just, merge into another person and forget who they are on their own. And those are things you can put in an agreement, right? As far as how you're going to handle, whether it is, like you said, your own account, husband has his own account, and then we have a joint account, but we maintain some of our own sense of self. So then we don't end up feeling lost in this relationship and don't know who we are.
There was an article I saw not so long ago called The Me Marriage. And they pointed out that marriage was invented mainly for economic reasons, especially among the royalty. I don't think peasants bothered getting married. They just, but then the church got into the act. And now women and men want partnerships. They want someone interesting, someone who thinks that we are interesting. We want to be a better person because of living with this partner. And without personal and mutual growth, life as a married person becomes dull and boring.
Yes, especially, I know I've talked about it before, certainly on this podcast, is we are meant to grow and continue to better ourselves. And, sometimes you grow and your spouse doesn't. And if you grow together, then that can make it work. But many times that's not possible, or it just doesn't happen.
In mediation, very often I would tell stories or fables, like little parables. And sometimes people would come in married 15 or 17 years, and the wife especially would feel a little bit feeling kind of apologetic about wanting a divorce, like there was no violence, there was no cheating, and I would tell them, in the old days, people were not married longer than 15 years. There was malaria, there was tuberculosis and smallpox, and there were farm accidents, there were industrial accidents, and there were, and a lot of childbirth deaths. So people just weren't married that long. And so you're married, say, 25 years. The kids are in college. With good health, you're going to be living at least 25 more years. You're 50 years old. You look across the breakfast table one morning and you think 25 more years. Well, maybe. Right?
Yeah. Oh, I know. I hear that all the time. And they think I'm not going to spend this period of time with this person, or I still have a lot of living you have to do. And this is not who I want to do it with. And it's like, they wake up and it's like, wow, I'm not the same person. You are the same person, or you're not. And it's just not how I want to spend the next 25 years of my life. And you're right, because people live so much longer. And, in this world that we live in, like, things are changing, and the world's changing so fast. It's understandable that may not be able to keep that up together, for sure. That might not be anything we can put in a premarital agreement that can help. I don't know. Or I guess we could put it in and say, after 25 years, like, we can both agree, like, hey, we're done. Let's go, right?
I heard someplace that people were thinking about having agreements to be married solely for raising children. And then when the kids were done and gone, it's over.
Huh.
How's that for a concept?
I don't know. Yeah, that's very interesting. But I can see they're entering into a business deal essentially, but that sounds really lonely. It's like, why would you even bother? I don't know. I think your kids might feel a little bit
my young medium even asked me the other day when we were talking about this prospective podcast. She says, well, what's the main cause of divorce? I said, good health.
That's a good one. I'm going to quote you on that, because you are right. Good health. That's for sure. Now, all right. Now, in your incredible book, I do want to talk about some of the sections that outline debts and maybe reimbursements before, after, and during marriage, because, you outline, of course, when you get married in the book, you're responsible for debts incurred by your spouse during marriage. And that's the way it is in Florida as well. Yeah. But unless in the book, it says, unless you live separately, but also you have to have an agreement, right? Because in Florida, even though you live separately, if you're still married, it just would be something to argue over. It wouldn't be a straight answer that, oh, well, we live separate, so we're not responsible for one another's debts.
Yeah, it's best to have it in writing. In California, If you're living separately, your debts would be separate, but except for necessary support. Oh, and I should bring up the fact that going back to prenups and the enforceability, you could have in your premarital agreement a waiver of spousal support that's totally legal and enforceable unless there's some circumstance that happens that makes it totally inequitable to enforce that. For example, if the spouse is disabled in an accident or is now suffering from terminal cancer, the court would not terminate support in those circumstances.
And I think that's really important, because ultimately the court ought to and should have the ability to be equitable. And certainly that would be something that was never anticipated. You had no idea, and it would be wrong to enforce that or provision when then they no longer have any means or ability with which to support themselves.
And interestingly, the Florida law, I noticed, says that if the spouse is going to qualify for welfare, then you have to pay support to keep her off or him off of welfare.
Well, and that's part of, where a lot of the Florida public policy is like, hey, if the spouse is going to now need the support of the state of Florida, but you have the ability to provide the support, then state shouldn't have to do it. You should have to do it. Yes. And, I think that makes sense. And that's where the state does have an interest. However, you're still going to have to fight for that spousal support without a doubt. Child support is definitely much more black and white, of course, as it should be. Right. Now, this is interesting. I think in your book, you mentioned reimbursements. Like you might, if your marriage ends, you might be entitled to reimbursement for expenses paid during your marriage.
Well, it's if you pay somebody's premarital debts, or let's say you own a house when you're married, before you're married, and then you refinance, and then it has a community property interest, you're entitled to be reimbursed the value of your house as of the date you got married.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Now, what if it wasn't? Now, I'm guessing if you refinanced, that doesn't necessarily mean you retitled.
That's true.
But if you retitled, would you still get that reimbursement, you think?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, okay. See, in Florida, it'd be a hard one to win.
I had a case where we had to track down a real estate expert who could evaluate the house from 20 years before to determine. So I would say if you own a house and there's the prospect of refinancing or selling to buy a new house, put in writing what it's worth when you get married. So
agreed, and that you're going to get that back like off the top. That's yours. It's not something to be split. You didn't mean it to be a gift, because that's the way Florida's going to look at it, is you gifted it.
Let's say you have an inheritance and you invest it in a Jaguar. Sorry, you don't get that money back. I mean, the car is not the same as a house.
Right. Mm-hmm.
It deteriorates in value and probably gets wrecked anyway.
Well, and also, I think that just goes in line with, just our laws in general. Property, real property, meaning our homes and things like that, are held in a little bit higher regard as far as, especially the way it's titled. And in Florida, when you retitle maybe your premarital home, you don't have to do that when you refinance, but if you do, now the presumption is going to be you gifted that with your spouse. Now you're both on the deed, and it's going to be very hard to, absent a premarital or a post-nuptial agreement, an agreement that is a valid contract that says, no, this money I put in individually, not intended as a gift. I want this back if anything, happens in the marriage.
Yeah, you're also entitled to reimbursement. Let's say your spouse commits some tort, injures somebody, and there's a judgment against your spouse. If any community property is being spent for that, you're entitled to reimbursement for your half of the community property. Oh, and I had one case. I had one mediated divorce where a husband was a public official from another county, and of course he didn't want any dirty laundry in the public courts. So wife found out from her daughter, her 12-year-old daughter discovered online that dad was having an affair.
Ooh, ooh.
He'd been having an affair for 12 years.
Oh.
And, excuse me, 5 years. And wife was outraged because she'd been pinching pennies and he was spending money on another woman. So she was the community is entitled to reimbursement for every dime he spent on the other woman, because that was money spent not in the furtherance of any community interest. So he came in with a 2-inch stack of records and totaled up what he had spent on that woman. And the total was $40,000. So in the settlement agreement we wrote, when the house sold, from his half, he paid her $20,000.
Well, okay, right, because he spent the 40, half of that was hers, so now he's got to give her that half back. Well, that was some good sleuthing on her daughter's part to benefit the mom to get that money back, I guess, right?
Yes.
And that doesn't even require a prenup because that's just part of the community property law.
Right.
And really we would
and the fiduciary obligation.
yeah, because you guys got this nice fiduciary obligation. We would call that a dissipation of assets.
Okay.
And it would just depend on how long back it went. And sometimes it's hard to get the records and prove it. But if you can, yes, you can make that argument certainly to get that back. But it is very interesting. And I think that's great. This mutual fiduciary obligation, Judith, that's a big deal to have that in California. I wish we had something that was really a little bit more specific in Florida. I think that could be very beneficial.
I think it would also apply, let's say, if you took community money to Las Vegas and lost it all.
Yes.
You know? Now, if your spouse went with you and you were gambling together, fine, no problem. But if you went on your own and you knew your spouse did not approve of gambling, but you said you were going to a convention,
right?
And you spent this money, the community, we call it community reimbursement, because half of it is yours anyway. So therefore, you pay back the community.
Pay back
and
the community.
And if you're split up, well, then you just pay the half to the other spouse.
Well, I really find that fascinating. I've enjoyed this conversation so much, Judith. Thank you so much for being on our show. It's really been fascinating. I know our listeners have enjoyed it. And of course, you can find out more about Judith at www.judithkaluzny.com or www.marriagelicensetest.com, which I encourage everybody to take that. And of course, listeners, you can also look out for her new publication, tentatively titled The American Way of Divorce, that will be available soon, right, Judith?
Right.
Well, we look forward to that very much. I'll definitely want to get my copy. But lastly, Judith, before we go, can you impart on our listeners, what have you learned about divorce, marital agreements, and representing and teaching women throughout your career?
Oh dear. One thing I learned from a client is being right does not get you what you want.
Oh, that's another one. We got to write down these quotes of Judith, because that one's a good one.
She was telling me all these infractions ex-husband was making in terms of visitation and child support. He can't do that. You're right. He can't do that. You're right. And yeah, you're right, but it doesn't get you what you want, because there's no court can enforce those little things like that.
I know.
So being right does not get you what you want. Being effective does.
That's a great note to end on. And Judith, I appreciate it so much. And to our listeners, if you or someone you know is going through a divorce or has any questions or is thinking about a divorce, of course, reach out to us at Florida Women's Law Group, because we are here to help you and guide you through this. And of course, all of Judith's contact information will be available in our show notes for our California listeners who have maybe specific questions for Judith in that area. Thank you once again.
And thank you. I had a good time.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Women Winning Divorce. My goal is to elevate your life and the way you are thinking so that you are best equipped to win at life. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe so you automatically get my new shows every week. And I would love to hear from you personally. Come join the conversation on social and join our Facebook group, Women Winning Divorce. We welcome your comments and suggestions. We want to bring you content that helps move your life forward. Women Winning Divorce is the place for an elevated conversation on how women can thrive during times of adversity in order to live their best life.